the Iranian objective basically is to see the elimination effectively of an independent Jewish state, the elimination of Israel. I mean, so they're not interested. All this is sort of, for them, is irrelevant. At the end of the day, they're not interested, for instance, in a two-state solution. So their objective is fairly explicit. It's shared by Hamas, shared by many of what they would call the axis of resistance. So we need to be aware of that. They're not going to be that bothered about these, what they would consider to be, all these are sort of tweaking around the edges and basically the malign activities of Israel. I mean, they're not going to be interested in negotiating or discussing any of the finer details of these sort of things.
Let's focus on Iran for the next few minutes. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is arriving in the Middle East today. Tensions are growing, many of them blamed on Iran. They, of course, back Hamas, Hezbollah and Houthi rebels who are attacking ships in the Red Sea. We know, of course, that Islamic State group claimed responsibility for the bombings in Kerman, which happened a few days ago. It killed at least 84 people. Let's speak now to Professor Ali Ansari, who is from St Andrews University. He specialises in studies of the Iranian state. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
In light of the bombing in Iran, which, as we say, IS have claimed responsibility for, there's also, of course, the killing of the deputy leader of Hamas and Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. How likely do you think there is to be an escalation into a wider regional war?
Well, I think one of the problems we face is that we really are teetering on the edge in many ways. I mean, what's actually happening is that there are so many areas of tension at the moment that it's a bit worrying about. One of them could spark off something much wider, particularly in Lebanon. We've obviously seen this with the Houthis in Yemen. The Iranians, for their part, are playing a very cautious game on one level, certainly on a public forum. They don't want anything to become too widespread. Principally because, as far as I'm concerned, certainly they don't feel they can sustain anything much more serious than what they're doing at the moment. But of course, they're pushing the boundaries of the envelope, and this is what worries many people.
That's interesting. So do you think then it's unlikely there would be any direct intervention by Iran, and actually it's more convenient to use proxies like the Houthis?
Yeah, I mean, basically the Iranian sort of way in warfare, if you can put it that way, is to use proxies and to use allies to basically achieve their aims and to claim plausible deniability as far as they can. And in this, they've been, to be fair, fairly successful at doing this. I mean, a lot of people don't want to draw the Iranians in. They don't want to sort of confront the Iranians. Interestingly, in my view, certainly, if you allow the Iranians to keep pushing the boundaries of the envelope as they are, then the risks become higher as you go forward.
How much control does Iran have over these proxies, whether it's the Houthis, whether it's Hezbollah, whether it is Hamas? How much do they listen? I know they provide the funding, but how much do they listen to Iran?
I think the way you have to look at them is basic. I mean, it depends on the groups. I mean, Hezbollah, the relationship is quite tight. Certainly, there's a lot of funding. There's a lot of close liaison. I think with Hamas and the Houthis, it's perhaps less so. But nonetheless, I think it's probably greater than some people are suggesting. I mean, if the Iranians wanted to pull their support, finance, weapons and others, I mean, let's be frank about it, the attacks that are going on in the Red Sea could not have been achieved without the sort of weaponry that the Iranians are providing the Houthis. So the Iranians could limit that. There is a tendency, I think, in some of the sort of commentary that you're seeing to try and play down the Iranian sort of association because we don't want to really think about, what the consequences of that would mean. But I think, in my view, that's a mistake. I mean, I think you have to, treat the world as you see it and basically recognize what the Iranians are up to. The Iranians are playing a very, very dangerous game, in my view. And you can already see that, in their reaction, basically, to what's happened on the 7th of October in Israel and obviously the ongoing in Gaza war, that they've tried to pull back, in actual fact. I mean, they've tried to sort of play down their own involvement on the one hand, certainly on a formal basis. But then if you go on to social media and you look at the sort of the commentary coming out of Iran in many ways, they're enormous cheerleaders for what's going on against Israel. So they're on the one, they really do want to have their cake and eat it. And I think I think this is a very sort of dangerous strategy for them to pursue.
So are you saying that you feel Western countries should have a more direct approach with condemning Iran?
I certainly think Western countries are probably privately being much more explicit in their commentary towards Iran. I think they could afford, in my view, to be a little bit more explicit in public too.
We know that today there has been this post-war Gaza plan, which has been outlined by the Israelis. How is that going to be greeted in Iran? Because that's going to be presumably antagonistic.
Yeah, I mean, the Iranian objective basically is to see the elimination effectively of an independent Jewish state, the elimination of Israel. I mean, so they're not interested. All this is sort of, for them, is irrelevant. At the end of the day, they're not interested, for instance, in a two-state solution. So their objective is fairly explicit. It's shared by Hamas, shared by many of they would call the axis of resistance. So we need to be aware of that. They're not going to be that bothered about these, what they would consider to be all these are sort of tweaking around the edges and basically the malign activities of Israel. I mean, they're not going to be interested in negotiating or discussing any of the finer details of these sort of things.
Really interesting to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
That is Professor Ali Ansari from St Andrews University, specialises in the studies of the Iranian state. Worth saying that plan, which has been released by the Israeli Defence Minister for what happens to Gaza after the war, the plan would be to have a limited Palestinian rule in the territory. Hamas would no longer control Gaza, and crucially, Israel say they would retain overall security control of the territory.